and we'll Okay, right. So it's lesson 3 of Stackademic. Today, as you know, we'll be talking about CSS. Today, the CSS part of this course is going to be split into 2 sections. So I'll elaborate on those in a moment. I'm just going to take a sip of water. So the first part will be covering, it will be covering these parts here. So we'll be looking at what CSS is briefly anyway, because obviously we've already covered that previously. We'll spend a bit of time talking about how to write CSS in terms of the actual syntax involved. Then we'll talk about some browser defaults, which is something, again, we touched on in the previous lesson. We'll talk about how to do things regarding margins and padding. We'll have a look at something called the box model. For some of you who have done CSS before, you might be aware of this. If you're not, that's absolutely fine. We'll be covering it. So we'll also do some things to do with measurements. And then we'll also cover all of the different ways that you can color something, how to manipulate text, how to add things such as custom fonts, and maybe even some best practices involving that. We'll spend a bit of time talking about images. We'll spend a bit of time looking at positioning of elements, something called pseudo classes, which you can think of as state in a way. It'll make sense when we go into it. And then we'll do a little bit to do with some CSS shorthands as well, which kind of gives us a way to group a bunch of values into one, kind of like an intermediate CSS technique. So I hope that all sounds okay. Just give me one moment. Okay, I just wanted to respond in the text. Okay, so let's begin. Okay, so the first thing, of course, is just kind of what is CSS? Well, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's the code that styles web content. Just to kind of briefly touch on why it's called Cascading Style Sheets, let me just take a sip of water before I do answer that. It's literally because it cascades, which kind of just means it goes from top to bottom. Now, the reason why that kind of makes some sense when you start to write CSS is, as you know, you can link files together. If we kind of look back at that very first piece of homework we had, where we uploaded a repository to GitHub and there were 3 files, some of you may have started to link those files together. Now, with CSS, if you link more than one file, for example, the very last file that you link, if there are any styles in there that you have maybe written in the previous file or the earlier files, that last file is going to overwrite the previous ones, which is kind of how this cascading thing works. It will start to make a lot more sense as we go through it. Just laughing at Ibrahim saying the classic water sip. Yeah, there will be many of those. So I've actually got 2 bottles of water with me today instead of 1. So I don't want to make the same rookie mistake I made last week where I had to pause to take or to get some water. As we mentioned, it's the code that styles web content. Now, as you may have remembered earlier in the previous lesson, when we spoke about HTML, we said it's not a programming language. It's a markup language, which is actually what the ML in HTML stands for. Now, just like how HTML is not a programming language, CSS is not a programming language either. It's not a programming language. It's not a markup language. It's a style sheet language. And it's, like, as we said, it's what we use to style HTML elements. I probably should have gone on to that slide as I was talking, but nevertheless, there you go. Hopefully that's something that you'll remember. And if any of you are taking screenshots, which I know some of you do, this might be a nice one to take a screenshot of. Okay, so how do we write CSS? Well, as some of you will know, this is typically what CSS styling can look like. For anyone who hasn't written CSS before, what this is doing here is, if we look at that P, it's basically saying for any P tags that you are using in your document, remember from the HTML lesson, P is short for paragraph and is just a paragraph tag. We're saying, okay, well, anytime you use a P tag, I want you to change the color of that text to red. To go into this in a bit more detail, we see here a little bit of an explanation as to what each value represents. So as we said, the selector or the P tag is what we would call a selector. The color is the property, and then red is the property value. And when you put those two together, the property and the property value, we call that a declaration. Some other important parts of the syntax. So apart from the selector, each rule set must be wrapped in curly braces. Curly braces are they're the things that you can see on the right-hand side and directly below that P. So we've got the opening curly brace, and then right at the end, we've got the closing curly brace. Inside of that is color red. Now, within each declaration, you have to use a colon immediately after the property. And then at the end of the property value, you always close it off with a semicolon. This is different to something that you may have seen a conversation take place on Twitter with myself and Piero with regard to whether semicolons are necessary in JavaScript. Now, that's something we'll talk about, kind of further down the line, and it may even be something that we talk about on Wednesday when Piero and myself have a kind of group chat. But in CSS, you have to use the semicolon. If you don't use the semicolon, or even if you don't use that colon as well, it will break the CSS you're writing. So you have to follow this setup every time you write something in CSS. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight this as well. You'll see this in a moment, but when in our HTML document, when we want to link to a separate file, in our case, a separate CSS file, this is typically what you would see. We've got a link tag, which is our HTML tag, and then we're setting this attribute on it of href, which is basically just like a link. We can just think of it as link. And then we're linking to our style.css, and we also give it this rel value, which is just kind of, it basically just is like relation. We're just saying, what is this file that we're expecting? In our case, it's a style sheet. So that brings us to the end of this kind of presentation part. So you'll see my face again in a moment. Here I am again. Yeah, I agree, Ibrahim. That tag is also the most Googled line. I often get that mixed up with sometimes even the script one. I think when I'm trying to import like a bunch of things at the top, I'll sometimes forget which one's which. So we're now going to switch to CodePen, and you're going to see, well, I'll continue talking, but you're going to see us write some code. Now, for this, I actually picked one of your homeworks from last week, the HTML homework. So one of you lucky persons is going to see me mess around with your code. I know, Hafiz, who could it be? Well, we'll find out in a moment, won't we? Okay, so here we go. Hopefully you can see some code, and I picked Ursula's. I basically just kind of picked anyone at random. So by that, that's not to discredit Ursula, but more just to say I didn't pick someone on the basis that everything they did was right. I just picked one that so let's move on and continue to talk about all of the different things that we can do. And by the way, Ursula, when I did look through this, it's pretty good. So I have actually marked this one as complete, whereas everyone else's I still need to do. So please be patient with me and we'll get those done throughout the week. Okay, so now we've got an idea of kind of the syntax for CSS. Now, the first thing I have done, I just want to make sure you can see this all as well. Great. So you can see the two files on the left-hand side. You can see that index.html and style.css. So the index.html is basically everything that Ursula wrote, plus a couple of things I've added in there now. And then this style file is just it was an empty file, but there's just a couple of things in there that we'll talk about in a bit. Now, the first thing is these two files are not linked together. But as soon as I uncomment this, now they are linked together, okay? I'll save it, and you won't see anything change because I've not written anything. Although, tell a lie, I actually have just updated the font. Let me just check something. I think that is because I have added one somewhere. Actually, no, that doesn't make sense because I haven't added it anywhere. In fact, I took it out. I think something's not quite right there. Seems as though it's caching something. Okay, great. So it's gone now. That's fine. So you uncommented the style.css line. Indeed, I did. That was deliberate. It was just to because you might have noticed that a font changed on there. That was because I added a font earlier when I was preparing this. I took it out, but CodePen had cached the font. So even though the font was no longer in the file, it was still pulling that in. So hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, exactly. It went to serif, whereas now it's gone back to what is the browser default. Okay, so just taking another sip of water. And by the way, actually, it wasn't Verdana, but I will show you what font it is in a little while. Okay, so what could we do to this file? Well, to begin with, let's kind of elaborate on that thing we had earlier where we had that p tag and it was red. So let's actually add that in to our file. So you can see here, we've got a p tag down here. One thing I'll just highlight as well is that there are the three most common ways that you could write CSS would be to either A, write CSS directly on the p tag by like doing style and then writing about it. The second way is you could somewhere up here, I could make maybe not there actually. I could make a style element and then start to write the styles inside of it. But the most common way you'll do it typically is in a separate file, which is what we've got here, and now they're linked up. So if you ignore this code we've got here for the moment, this is just so I can demonstrate something to you in a little while. If we go down here, and now if we write color red, and then we make sure that's all closed off, as some of you will be expecting, we will see some red text here. So we've finally got some red text, which means we definitely know that our style sheet is linked up and it's targeting that p tag we've got here. And then if there are any other p tags in here, it'll get them as well, as we can see with this blog title one down here as well. Okay, well, what if we wanted to do a few more things on there? So maybe we could, maybe we want to change the size of the font. Now, we will talk about sizing in a while, but all I'm trying to highlight here is that you can write multiple changes in here. So if I wanted to make this 18 pixels, then we'll see that the font gets a little bit bigger. Let's just actually make it massive so you can really see the difference. You can see here we've got bigger text. So all I'm trying to highlight here is that you can write lots and lots of things inside of here. And it will target every P tag that you've got. Okay, well, what if I wanted to use this same styling that I've set up here, but maybe I wanted to target other elements as well, such as where it says personal profile, for example. Well, that is a H2 tag. We know that because we can see here it's H2. So if we wanted to target that as well, what we could do is we could put a comma here. We could write H2. It's going to target both of those. And we'll see here that this now also is 36 pixels and it's also red. One thing you'll notice is that it still looks different to the actual P text below. Now, the reason for that is because of those browser defaults that we mentioned earlier. They still are existing on the H2 tag. So I hope that makes some sense. Just going to take a sip of water. Okay, so that's one way we could. Oh, actually, Hafiz, would you, if you'd like to speak,
yeah,
you are more than welcome.
Can I? Yeah. So H2 here is not changing the font of personal. I mean, this heading, personal profile. Is it changing?
So it's not changing the font itself, but we have changed the size of it. So you'll notice personal profile is the same size as the text below it.
Okay.
Because we are targeting both of those with this kind of declaration we've written.
Okay, because I was thinking that because H2 already is in bold. I mean, because it's a heading, so it already has some kind of size specific for H element.
Yes, yeah, but you're exactly right. The only thing is we have changed the size of it, so it is now 36. It could be that was actually the browser default anyway for H2 tags. Let's make it even bigger. Let's make it 48 pixels. Now, if we save that again, you'll see that both of those are bigger, and now that H2 tag is even bigger than the H1 above it, where it says "Hello, I'm Ursula S." But yes, it still has some defaults. That's why it's thicker. That's why the text is thicker than the P tag below it. They're the same size, they're the same color, but there are still some browser defaults for both of those that we have not manipulated, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, great. All right. So yes, one way that we can target elements is by just directly using the element, for example, P, H2, and so on. But there are several ways that we can target elements. So let's try some of them now. So the first one and the most common one you're going to use is a class. So if let me get rid of that period for a moment. So let's say, for example, we want all H2s to also be red and also be 48 pixels. But maybe this very first one that says personal profile, we want to add some specific classes just for that H2. So we could do class equals, and then we use some speech marks, and then we call the class whatever we want. Ideally, we should be giving it an appropriate name. And by that, I mean, don't just put something like A, or don't put something that's not going to make sense to you 6 months later when you look at it. But something that could make sense. Let's maybe call this subtitle for now. The only reason I've chosen subtitle instead of title is because we've got this H1 up here, higher up, which maybe is our title. So let's just call this subtitle for now. Okay, so we've given it a class name. Now we could go back into our style sheet. We could do dot, and we always, whenever we are targeting a class, it will always begin with dot when we're writing the styles. And then we could put subtitle. And then we follow this same pattern that we were using before. So we've got some curly braces. And now let's make this color, let's make it purple. Okay, so if we save that, we should now see, one moment, subtitle. I have given those all the right names, haven't I? Let me just save. Oh, wait, I think it's because I haven't saved the index.html as well. Sorry, I'm so used to using my own code editor where it's automatically saving everything. So now we'll see here that personal profile is purple. It's still got the styles, though, from the P that we did. Sorry, not from the P, but from this P and H2. So it still takes those, but it's also got this subtitle one here. But and if we have a look at the H2 further down, that hasn't got the purple color because it's not got the subtitle class on it. So hopefully that makes sense. And I know for some of you, this is going to be, you'll already know all of this, but of course, please be patient. We want to make sure everyone is at the same place. And yeah, Ibrahim, I agree, VS Code is the GOAT. Could not agree more. Okay. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought now. Okay, so we've got classes, which is typically what you're going to use when you're styling things. There is also an ID. There's an ID tag that we can use. Okay, instead of it being a dot or a period, we use a hash or a hashtag, as some of the cool kids know it as. And let's just call this title. And we're going to put color blue, font size 24 pixels. Of course, we haven't given this to anything yet. So let's give this to, let's give it to this one here. Now, and instead of class, we put ID equals. And we put our speech marks, and I can't remember what we called it. Oh, we called it title, didn't we? Okay, so we can put that there, and then professional experience should be blue, and it should be a little bit smaller, or quite a bit smaller. Now, the thing is, and I've noticed this sometimes with people who are new to CSS, that they'll start using just any of these tags or any of these selectors, I should say. Now, the thing with ID is typically, well, there's two things. Firstly, only one element in your document should have that ID. In other words, when you're making classes, so such as that subtitle class, you could use that lots of times in your files. That's fine. Whereas an ID should only exist on one element. So, for example, if we look at that personal experience H2, that's got a title, fine, but I should not be giving this to anything else. So I should not be putting it there, for example, and there. It wouldn't break your code, but you shouldn't be using it in that fashion. That's what classes are for. The reason, and the second reason, is that when you start to write JavaScript, there's something called DOM manipulation, which I'm sure some of you will know. DOM is short for Document Object Model. And you will use IDs sometimes when you want to grab a hold of certain elements and do something with them. You would use IDs for that. You wouldn't use classes. So if I was going to give you any sort of advice, I would say this: just stick to using classes. Only use IDs when you want to manipulate them with JavaScript. Don't just use them for styling. But nevertheless, I wanted you to at least see what an ID looks like. Then we've got other things that we could do, such as attributes. Now, attribute selectors are what we would use for targeting elements that have certain attributes. We don't necessarily have any that we could use right now, but let's say that let's imagine that we just had a button here. And let's give it a name of first name. Okay. So if we had this, for example, let me just make sure you can see that as well. So you can see this little button that we've got in the bottom left-hand corner. If we had this, then we could theoretically write something such as button, and I believe it's something like that. You'll have to bear with me if that's not entirely right. I'm pretty certain it's something along the lines of this. In fact, let's just try it. Let's give it a background color of red. Let's see if that works. There we go. Yeah, so you can see it's targeting that button specifically. And just to clarify that we're not targeting every single button here, if we give this second, oh, not section, second name, oh, let's just, there we go, second name. If we save those, then you'll see that that second button doesn't have the same styling as that first one. So if you want to get really specific and maybe only target a certain button, for example, for whatever reason, then you could use that, which is what we call attribute selecting. And this is typically the same kind of format that you would have. This can be useful in other areas as well, but we won't get into it any further. And then one other thing that we wanted to talk about is something known as pseudo classes, which we will look at in a little while. But if we wanted to write a pseudo class, it would be something like this, where it's button and then colon hover, and then we just write our styles. We'll have a look at pseudo classes in a little while. Some of you probably can already guess what that does. Some of you will just already know what that does. But yeah, we'll cover it in a little while. Hafiz says highlights. Kind of. You're in the right ballpark. I'll just tell you anyway. I might as well. So it's well, while hovering. Yeah. So the color would change to red whilst hovering. That would be it. Okay. So as mentioned before, we've got browser defaults, which are things that we need to kind of contend with. Actually, no, I can show you. Let me just load up this page and then I'll switch to the screen. There's a really cool website called browserdefaultstyles.com. Let me share that in the chat. Don't worry about going on it now, but if you're ever curious to see what browser defaults look like, then that is an option for you. Let me switch to the other screen. Okay, let me just see. Okay, actually, that's a good question, Ax. He said, you think the button preceding the square brackets is redundant? Well, let's try it. So if we just got rid oh, you can't actually see the screen anymore, can you? By the way, though, you are correct, Ax, that you could theoretically just get rid of that button and it would still work. So putting it with button and then an attribute would give it an additional specificity. But no, that's a good point that you raise as well. Okay, so hopefully you can see this browser default styles screen. Now let's just put H2 in there, seeing as that's what we looked at before. You'll see on here that all of that stuff you can see on the screen is that's basically all of the styles that the browsers add onto it. You'll see as well there are some little icons on the right hand side, so you can see some browsers do certain styles whereas others don't. You may notice actually though that in the case of say this H2, margin block start, margin block end exist on Safari here. They're also on Firefox there, and they're also on all of the other browsers there. These are called WebKit ones. These are the ones that you can see. what this demonstrates actually is a good thing, and it's that the browsers more recently are trying to converge and actually use the have some kind of normality and consistency with one another. Whereas if you went back 5 or 10 years ago, your website might look quite a lot different in different browsers, and it still will to some extent, especially if you end up writing a website that maybe needs to be viewable by people maybe using Internet Explorer. So maybe it could be in some parts of the world that they're still using it. Some companies have very kind of old systems in place where they still need those browsers. And it's something to bear in mind, these browser defaults. So for all intents and purposes, most websites that you'll be building will look the same, but there might be some instances where you need to care more about this. But nevertheless, hopefully this highlights why that H2 still had some different styles. So let's come out of that. You'll see my face again briefly, and then we will bring up Ursula's code again, which is hopefully this one. Okay. And yeah, just to highlight the point you mentioned, Ax, a moment ago, if we get rid of that button selector at the beginning, it's still got the red button. And you can see there, actually, when I highlight it, the text color is actually changing red as well, which just makes it, well, it's a some crap styling I've made there, but hopefully it explains the point at least. Don't actually design a website that has a button that changes the text in that color. Okay, so next I wanted to spend some time talking about margins and padding. It's something known as the box model. So it's going to be a little bit difficult to explain this whilst using this code pen thing. So what I want you all to do is have a look into this in a bit more detail further down the line. But CSS layout is mostly based on the box model. So what that means is each box takes up space on your page, okay? And will have properties such as padding, border, and margin. Now, hopefully what I can do is highlight some elements because I've got the Chrome inspector open. I think you can still see those things. Yeah, it looks like you can. That's good. So also, as well, interestingly, you might remember in the last lesson, we were talking about element level elements and inline level elements. So a good way to be able to see if something's, if something's block level or inline level is when you're highlighting things with the Chrome inspector, you'll see that this Hello, I'm Ursula S actually spans the entire width of the screen. Even though the content is only in kind of maybe the first 100 pixels, and that's because it's a block level element. If we go down a bit more, you can see that these list elements are also block level, but inside of those list elements, we've got these A tags for links, and these are only inline level. So you can see there's a big difference there with how much space each one actually takes up, based on how the defaults are anyway. Okay, so a lot of the time when you're styling things, you will find yourself spending a lot of time dealing with margins, padding, border, and so on. So if you imagine that every element you make in HTML is a box to begin with, of course, some of these are rectangles, but it's a box-like structure in that it has 4 sides. You'll see here that, yeah, so it has those 4 sides, and typically there will be padding, which is the space around the content, the border, which you can think of as a solid line that sits outside of the padding, and then you've got a margin, which is space that sits outside of the border, okay? And then inside everything, you've got content, which is the actual content. So that might sound a little bit strange for some of you who are kind of just new to all of this. So what we're going to do is let's target this image that we've got at the top. So we've got this image source here. Let's put a class on it, and we'll just call this banner. In fact, we'll call it banner image. Okay, so we've got banner image. Let's move down here, make banner image. Okay, so we said we've got a margin, we've got padding, we've got a border, and then we've got content. In this case, the content is the image, which is just kind of taking up all of the space that we've got there. But if we put a border on it, then we could put something maybe like border 1 pixel. In fact, let's not use the shorthand. Let's do border width 1 pixel. Border color, let's make it red again. And then, well, we can't actually see that. Have I put it on there? Oh yeah, I have. In fact, you know what? Let's take it off there. Let's just put it on this H1 for now. And we'll just call it banner for now, which is a bad name. Okay, so don't start using names like banner for H1. We're just doing this purely to demonstrate something, but where is it? Okay, that's strange. It doesn't seem to be targeting it. Let's just try this again. 10 pixel solid red. Okay, that's strange. Maybe I had the kind of long names incorrect. Anyway, so you can see here we've put this kind of 10 pixel solid red border on there. It doesn't look good, but it's essentially this border is sitting outside of the content. Okay. If we wanted to put a margin on there, we could do something such as 20 pixels. And you may not notice anything at the moment. That's okay. Let's put some padding on this as well of 20 pixels. And you'll start to see some things change. Now, if we highlight this, Google Chrome nicely gives us these different colors for it. Now, if you imagine that the content is what we're seeing in the very innermost bit, typically, when you're styling elements, you will use something known as the box model, and usually it'll be border box. And what this means is border box. I'm trying to think of a nice way to kind of demonstrate this. With border box, the size of it, in fact, let's not worry about that for the moment, because I don't think this is kind of the best way to explain it. But essentially, when you're styling elements, if you think of it like this, you've got 4 things. The innermost is the content, which is typically the thing that you're adding there, like the text, for example. And then immediately outside of that, you've got padding, which you can use to kind of create some space inside of the box. Then you've got something such as a border, which creates that red border on there. So in this moment, you've got padding inside the border, and then you've got content inside the padding. And then on the very outermost side, you've got the margin, which sits outside of the margin. It sounds probably a little bit confusing as I'm going through it like this. So it's good to just get some practice in with it. But the reason why I wanted to just spend a moment talking about things such as kind of the sizing differences is, oh wait, sorry, someone's just messaged me. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to mention this is because when you're writing CSS, there's kind of these 2 frameworks in place, there's 2 frameworks that operate when we're writing CSS. There's the content model, which was kind of like the original framework. And then there's the box model, which is what we tend to use more often over the past decade. And there are differences between the 2. And what happens is when you're, say, creating a width for an element, If you use border box or content box, it can kind of manipulate or change the way that you expect certain styles to work. I know this isn't necessarily the best explanation of it, so please bear with me. But I just wanted to show you these two elements here. Oops, sorry about that. Let's just get rid of that. And get rid of that. Okay, so we should have two boxes now. You can see this here. It says, hi here, I'm a content box and I'm a border box. Now, I've already written some styles for these earlier. You see we've got this border box, and then we're actually targeting the P element inside of the border box. If we uncomment these, and then, like I said, we've got this content box as well, and we've got we're targeting the P inside of the content box. You'll see though that the styles, the content box, those two content boxes are the same as the styles that we've got for this border box here. But because we're using this box sizing border box thing, it changes the way that they look. And you'll see here that even though these two styles are exactly the same, the first one is kind of just extending beyond and looks a bit weird. One way that you can just never have to worry about this is by writing what is known as a kind of a wildcard or universal selector in your CSS. For some of you who have written CSS before, you've probably seen this. It's just this here. So this asterisk you can see at the top, in the top left-hand corner, is a wildcard. And we're basically just saying target every single element that gets created. If we put this box sizing border box on it, then it's not going to cause the issues that we had with, say, these content box models. And you'll see here that if we take these off, because bear in mind that when they're on this still, it's overwriting the original, which was that border box. If we take them off, then it should update those styles to look the same as each other. So this is something that you might see quite often and might not necessarily understand why it's there, but hopefully that sheds a bit of light on it. There is actually a slightly better practice that someone by the name of John Neal kind of came up with, which is to write this instead. If the copy and paste works, which it doesn't seem to want to at the moment. There we go. So you could write something like this instead, which will do the same thing, but kind of give it a little bit of better targeting. I wouldn't worry too much about understanding why, but it's just a case of if you end up importing libraries by someone who maybe created the styling back in the day when they were using content model, then this won't kind of override those issues that they had. Anyway, I know that was a little bit of a confusing explanation, but it's because it requires more time to think about it, and I would encourage you to look into it in a bit more detail. Okay, so let's actually get into some interesting, well, kind of more useful things now. So one thing I wanted to talk about is measurements. Okay, and by this I mean the different types of measurements that are available to you when you are styling things. Oh, Hafiz, what are these before and after selectors? Good question. These are pseudo selectors. Okay, I won't explain too much specifically what these before and after ones are doing, but it's for content immediately before or immediately after an element. Kind of, we'll leave it at that for the moment. It will make sense to you as you kind of advance through this. So in fact, let's get rid of those for the moment because it's probably just getting in the way. Okay, so measurements. Now there's two measurements you've seen so far. If we look at these, we'll get rid of these content box ones here. But you'll see these border box ones that we've got still. Let's just bring the border box into the screen here. Okay, so there are two types of measurement we've used so far, which you can see. We've got px. So if we look at, say, padding, it's got 10 px just being short for pixels. But then if you look at width, we've got a percentage as well of 100%. Let me just take another sip of water. Okay, so lots of different ways that you can measure things. The first one that we can think of is something known as a relative length unit, which represents a measurement in terms of some other distance. And depending on the unit, this can be, it can be the size of a specific character, the line height, the size of the viewport, for example. If we look at this kind of width of 100% on the border box, the 100% here is effectively the size of the container. In this case, the container is basically kind of just like the body, really, or whatever the outermost is. And when we're saying width 100% for this border box, we're saying, okay, take up 100% of the available width that the container is providing. Let me just see. Question again. Hafiz, what we'll do, I will answer these questions in the Q&A section at the end. So save up the questions for the moment, just so we can kind of continue. But don't worry, nothing to apologize about. Okay, so for example, if we change this to 80%, naturally, as you'll imagine, it's probably going to get smaller, and it does, because it's taken up 80% of the available 100% that you can see in terms of the width. Okay, so we've got things like that. There's also other ones such as viewports, which we'll talk about in a moment. In fact, no, we'll talk about it now. So seeing as we mentioned percentages, so we've also got VH and VW. Okay, now if you think the viewport is the available space in the screen at that time. So our viewport here is probably quite small, because if you think that what you can see is a code editor at the top, but then below it is the viewport, it's quite small. But if we ended up expanding the page, for example, then the viewport changes with that. But if we write something like 80 VW and then save that, you'll see it's actually still the same, more or less, because the viewport is 100, which is the available width inside of it. What we could do is, we've got this border box P below it. Maybe if we change that to 50 VW, then you'll see that becomes smaller as well. Okay, so in other words, when you're doing things such as width and height, you could use percentages, or you could use viewports as well. And VW is viewport width, VH is viewport height. There are also some other ones such as Vmax, Vmin, and things like that. But we'll move on. Other ones that we have are font relative lengths. So you only use these typically on fonts. So let's go back to this P and H2 one that we did earlier. In fact, let's get rid of the H2 on there. And let's look at the massive paragraph tag that we have here. So when you start writing CSS, usually it's quite normal to reach for the pixel height when doing things such as font sizes. And this is okay if you're trying to do specific things, but there are some better options available. And these better options are known as M, or EM, I should say, or REM, which is REM. And these are used to create scalable layouts. So these are important if you're trying to do things such as, well, imagine that you've got a user who is trying to increase the size of their screen. When you use fixed pixels, they can sometimes increase and decrease, but they might not increase and decrease relative with one another. If we use things like EM and REM, it will scale accordingly. So let me just check something. In fact, I should ask you all really. Does anyone know what M or REM stands for? Okay, that's fine. Okay, just reading what people are saying. Okay, so we've got things like rapid eye movement. Yeah, I guess it does mean that in some instances. Okay, we've got elastic measurement, emphasis. Oh, that's a good point, Kabir. It does mean emphasis when we're using it with HTML, but with CSS, it typically means something else. Now, the thing is, in reality, M doesn't stand for something specific. It's really what it is just a form of measurement. M is just a unit of measurement. I can't remember where it originates from. Maybe it's from something to do with kind of printer press and things like that. But either way, M is just a unit of measurement. When we use REM or REM, then as some of you have pointed out, the R stands for root. And this can be useful. It's typically what I would use if I'm writing CSS as well. So what we could do is on our HTML, or better yet, on our body, we could do something such as font size 16 pixels. And this is setting our, almost like our default that we want whenever we use M and REM, we want it to use 16 pixels as the basis for what it wants to scale to. So it's quite normal to do something like 16 pixels on the body, and most browser defaults actually do that anyway, but we could write it on there just as to be doubly sure. So we could do something like that, and then what we could do is whenever we're targeting, say, P elements, if we were to write something such as 1M, or better yet, 1 REM, because REM, it's debatable, but I would say it's a better practice than using M. So I would just get into a habit of using REM whenever you're doing font sizes. If we do 1 REM, the font sizes aren't going to change. You'll see that it's still like that. The reason is because 1 REM is basically like saying 100% of 16 pixels, which we set in the body. If I set this to 2 REM, as you might imagine, that would be 200% of whatever the original size was, which was 16 pixels on the body, which is going to give us this double size here. It can be a little bit confusing to understand why it is that we're doing this. Again, I would recommend that if this kind of thing interests you, you do some further reading into exactly why things like REM and M are used. But it's a better practice than using fixed pixels. As you start to write responsive websites as well, in other words, where the website adapts based on the screen size. So in other words, like a mobile phone or a tablet or a desktop, using things like REM instead of percentages instead of pixels is an easier way to reason with what you're doing. Okay, so those things that we mentioned, such as pixels as well, are what you could refer to as absolute length units. so we see here we've got this padding of 5 pixels. It's absolute in the sense that it doesn't change to anything. It's just always 5 pixels. Just so you're aware as well, typically for screen displays, 1 CSS pixel is equal to 1/96th of 1 inch. That's just a fun fact for you, I guess. It could be of use, maybe, who knows. So let's just show you a bunch of different ways that you could do some syntax for things such as measurements. So not 196th, but 1/96th. So 1/96. Okay, where is my screen? Here it is. So, of course, we're not targeting anything here, but just to give you some ideas of different ways that you can do lengths. We've got pixels, we've got M, or again, we could do rem. We've got percentages. We've got these keywords, which we haven't even touched on. And these global values as well. Again, I would suggest that you do some further reading to understand what these keywords do. Initial is and unset are kind of similar in the sense that they're like, okay, we'll just revert back to whatever the browser has or whatever the kind of container has. And inherit might be, okay, I want the same styles as something else. Okay, so, and of course you can do these things with height as well. So it's not just width, but you do have to be careful sometimes when you are styling things with height. Okay, so I wanted to just talk about colors as well. So another time to sip some water. And also, Grinicher, I love that you are mentioning Mozilla documentation, because Mozilla documentation is the GOAT, the GOAT of documents. Okay, so let's have a look at some colors. Now, I do apologize, Ursula. I have just removed your entire file. So don't worry, it's still on GitHub. It's just we are not going to look at that anymore for the moment. So this is a block of text. Hopefully this should just still show up. In fact, do you know what? Makes no sense to go back to that. It's better to just keep this, because then at least we've already got all of the style sheets linked. But we are just going to move out a lot of this. So let's just take all of that out for the moment. Okay. Okay, right. And yeah, I agree, Ibrahim. MDN is your go-to resource. And I'll also just say as well, like, thank you all for being patient with me. I know I'm stumbling through bits at the moment, but we'll carry on. So this is a block of text. Couldn't be more literal than that. Let's get rid of all of our styles and let's start again. So we've just got a p tag. If we save that, that should go back to black and back to the default, which is just 16 pixels. So even Microsoft, I'm just reading what Greenwich is saying, even Microsoft says MDN is the source of technical description for HTML, CSS, JavaScript, besides original standards. There you go. So even other companies are mentioning how good it is. Let me just mute everyone because I can hear somebody all of a sudden. There we go. Okay. So, right, we've got this block of text. So when it comes to colors, there are no less than 4 main ways that you can do it. There are more, by the way, but the most common ones you'll see involve what we could call kind of literal coloring. In other words, what I mean by this is if we put color and we could just write something like blue, it will update the color of text. We'll just make this a little bit bigger as well, because I'm mindful that it'll be quite small for people. There we go. You'll see that. So we've got this block of text here. So the most common way you can do it is by just saying the color. One thing I'll mention as well, for anyone who isn't used to American English, you might have noticed that color we're spelling is C-O-L-O-R. Even though I'm from kind of a British English background and would typically write color like that, CSS is written with kind of American English. So just bear that in mind when you are writing. Even for people as well, I guess an interesting kind of side point as well is that even when you're writing code, a lot of the time, you might not even be English, but the code has to be written in English or American English in this case, because it's just that's the standard. Is CSS American? I wouldn't say CSS. I guess what you're referring to is who created it. I think it might be actually. I mean, the kind of original person who invented the internet is Tim Berners-Lee, I think his name is, and he's British, but it doesn't mean that he's responsible for everything. Anyway, I'll stop going down that tangent, and we'll kind of save that for the Q&A session. Okay, so let me just check one thing as well. I just want to make sure that the recording is still okay. It looks like it is, but it might stop in a moment. So we've got lots of different ways that we can do coloring. We've got this kind of literal one here. And what I'll do is I'll just keep writing them below. And bear in mind, like I said, because it cascades, it goes from top to bottom. But as it goes down, whatever styles are below are the ones that will become the kind of the ruler, so to speak. So another way that we could write, another way that we could write color is by using hexadecimal values. For anyone who is aware of what hexadecimal is, then cool. For anyone who's maybe unaware, it's a counting system, I guess, really. I mean, it typically, it incorporates letters into it, which allows it to go up to 16. So there's 16 different variants. As someone has mentioned, base 16, you're absolutely right, is base 16. I actually did a video on kind of base systems, which I guess you can find on my YouTube. But anyway, so hexadecimal, long story short, we could write blue by writing blue, or we could use hexadecimal, and we could write something like that. It's not going to change the color of text because, of course, we've got this blue here. So let's comment that out, and you will see that it is still the same. Oh, wait, tell a lie. It's also requires that at the beginning to signify that it is hexadecimal, and you'll see there that it is now that color. So we've got that, which is hexadecimal, which typically operates by the first two characters, then the second two characters, and then the third two characters. We've got a third way, which is with RGB, which is RGB is just red, green, blue, which you would write by doing something like this, RGB, and then you would write the values in, and you could do that. And if we comment that out, it should still be blue. There we go. Don't worry if you're not kind of like used to writing these values. You might be wondering, like, how on earth can I know that it's 00255? I just do, but you'll pick it up with time. Another way is RGBA, which is red, green, blue, alpha, which is what we can use if we want to do things with transparency. So we can see here, if we write that, it's going to keep the same amount of transparency, which is this 1. So basically that operates from 0 to 1. 1 is equal to 100%, 0 is equal to 0%. If we put something like 0.5 in, then it should have 50% transparency, which, as you can see, it becomes a little bit lighter. If we did 0.1, then that's 10% transparency, and you can almost barely see it anymore. Let's just put that back to 1. Oh, not 11. I'm not turning things to 11 today. 10 points if anyone understood that joke. So, and then there's another one, which is HSL, which is hue, saturation, and lightness. This one's less common to use, but it does exist. And you write that by doing HSL and then writing whatever the hue, saturation, and lightness is. I think it's something like this. I mean, I don't use this one that often, as you can tell, at all, really. Okay, well, that's come out black. Never mind. But it's something along those lines anyway. Oh, wait, I put RSL. That doesn't help. Thank you, Freddie. Awesome, there we go. Cool. So we've got lots of different ways to do this. You can actually use alphas on those as well. And more recently, you can also use alphas on, when I say alpha, I mean transparency. You can also do it with hexadecimals as well. So if we did that, you can see it becomes super transparent. Do 90, we can bring it up, or we could do FF, which will bring it back up to 100%. As some of you will know, there are shorthands we can do for that as well, which we'll kind of cover in a moment. Right, so we've still got quite a bit to go, so I'm going to speed this up a bit. So sometimes you might want to use custom fonts. You might not want to just use this kind of basic Times New Roman that we've got here. There are loads of fonts available. You can find some online as well. And one that I like is this one called Roboto Mono. Now, these are just links. You can see kind of like this style sheet one that we've linked in here. But these are available for free. They're kind of Google open fonts. Now, if we put that on there, you'll see it doesn't change anything yet because we're not using it. So if we go on to our P tag and put font family, and then you could write something like that. Now, sometimes this will work, sometimes it won't. I just want to test it to show you if it does or doesn't. You see it does, but sometimes when they've got spaces in, you might actually need to turn it into a string like that. So, but that should still work anyway. And you'll see that it gives it this different text now. So you can do things like that. One thing that is a good thing to do in general is when you're giving these font families, you can actually pass in loads and loads of values. And what will happen is these become kind of backups in case that first one isn't available. So you'll see we've still got that there, but let's imagine that for whatever reason, this either doesn't exist, maybe the link's broken, maybe the user who's browsing your website has a bad connection and can't pick it up very quickly. We could do things like this. And in this case, it's still working, probably because of the caching thing I mentioned earlier, but it could also be because my computer has Roboto Mono already installed on it. It's probably that reason. So it's worth just bearing that in mind as well. And yeah, as Dee mentioned, in case the first font fails, then it's going to try and check the next one. In this case, it would be Arial. And then if that for some reason doesn't exist, which it pretty much does on most computers, but then it will just fall back to sans serif. For anyone unaware of what serif is, it's basically like the kind of curly bits on text. So Times New Roman is what we would call a serif font. sans serif, it's French. Sans means, you know, without. So it's saying without serif. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so let's push ahead. What I can do maybe is just make some of the notes I've got available kind of to, you know, for further down the line. But one thing to bear in mind is just kind of web safe fonts. By this, what we mean is just fonts that are kind of freely available. So users most likely have that font on their computer, like they will in the case of, say, Arial. But B, in terms of just kind of legibility as well. So, you know, if you're trying to make a website that's kind of accessible to as many people as possible, you might not want to pick fonts that, although they might look nice to you, they might not be easy to read. Whereas typically the ones that are available on computers tend to be fairly easy to read. So I wanted to try and talk about images, but let's just see if we can quickly bring one in. Oh, gosh, I can't remember the name of the URL. I should have just kept the one that Ursula had on there a moment ago. Give me one moment. Okay, here we go. Right, let's try and put this on. That should work. There we go. Cool. So a picture of me looking all fun. One thing you might have noticed as well with that image tag is, if you can remember from the last lesson, it's a self-closing tag. That's why we put this closing kind of forward slash on there rather than there being content inside. So we've got this image. We can do lots of things to style images. So let's do images, and we could do something such as width 200 pixels. Thank you, Igor. So yeah, we've got width 200 pixels there, which is just taking up 200 pixels of the screen. You don't want to typically do things with 200 pixels, but we could do that on there. I mean, it looks okay because it's a square image to begin with, but if we wanted to make it look stupid, we could do something like that, and then it's going to, you know, look like that. A way to avoid it is sometimes is just to focus on the width rather than doing the height as well, unless you're explicitly trying to do something. As you know, we've got other measurements we could use. So we could do something like 200 EM, and you can see it becomes massive. Let's bring that down to 50. And you could do things like that, or we could do something like, oh, not 500, no, that would be massive. Let's do 100%. The nice thing about using percentages is that, as you'll know, it will adjust with the size of the screen. So hopefully you can see the screen size changing, but the image just kind of scales nicely, you know, gracefully with it. Whereas if we're using those absolute values, as we mentioned before, it's not going to do that. So, but that might be what you want. So it's not to discourage you from doing that in the case of things like images, but just bear that in mind. Like you'll see as the screen goes smaller, that the image is no longer scaling with it. It stays as 1,000 pixels. There are lots of other things you can do as well. Like I said, we don't really have time to go through it at the moment. But if you were doing something like a background image on an element, then there are lots of things you could do for scaling. I'll give you some links to kind of have a look at for that. So I just wanted to briefly talk about positioning as well. Let's just, in fact, we'll use this image that we've created here. Now, when it comes to positioning, positioning allows you to take elements kind of out of the normal document flow, if that's what you wanted to do. So you can make them behave differently. As you've known, as you will know from the previous homework, when you write HTML, it's just the document just gets parsed from top to bottom. And that's the positioning of the elements, but you might not want it to be like that. So there are lots of different ways we can do it. Now, the first one to mention is position static. Now, that's not really going to do anything. That's just going to follow, that just kind of is following whatever the normal practice is, which is just to be where it should be, to be or not to be. So that's kind of static positioning. The next one we have is something known as relative positioning, which is typically, I mean, it just means it's the first position type. No, well, it means it's very similar to static positioning, the first one that we looked at, except that once the positioned element has taken its place in the normal layout flow, you can then modify its final position. What you'll find is that using position relative can be useful when you've got absolute elements that you want to position as well. So let me just see if I can quickly give you an example. Okay, so div, right, class, box. Okay, and then let's do another one of, let's just call this thing. Oops, I didn't close that one. Okay, then let's just put hi in there. So we've got two divs for anyone who can see that. Okay, and let's just scroll down. Let's just comment this picture of myself out. Okay, so you can see it just says hi there, but we've got box and thing. So let's just quickly create those. Oops. Okay, and then thing. Just give it 200 pixels. Let's put borders on these as well because it's going to make it easier to read. Okay, so if we save that, now we can see this. Okay, now let's also just put a height on this of 500 pixels. Okay, so now we've got a box, which is this one with the red border, and then we've got another element inside of it. So now if we gave this a position of relative, which is typically what we would expect it to be anyway, we could also then start to do things with absolute positioning as well. So absolute positioning kind of just, it's almost like, okay, I want this to be fixed in a certain place. So let's just put this as absolute. Now, nothing changes at the moment, as you can expect. So absolute is saying, okay, this is the absolute position that I want to be in with regard to the container, which is this box, which has relative. Now, if I do top, now, I should mention as well, when it comes to positioning elements with this position selector or value, attribute, I should say, we can use things such as top, bottom, left, and right to dictate where we want it to be. So we can see it starts to just change its position. But say if we wanted this blue box to be maybe not immediately on the left, we could do something like 20, maybe 20 pixels or 200 pixels. And you can see it starts to push it that way. This is possible by using things such as absolute on here. You might wonder why would you even do things like this, but there are certain situations where this can become useful. Along with absolute values, you can also use position fixed as well. Both of these can be useful when you're doing things such as, say, like a pop-up modal, like a confirmation screen or something like that. Or maybe you've got like a little button that you want to be in the bottom left-hand corner or bottom right-hand corner, and you just always want it to be there. Like, for example, if you've been on a website and there's maybe like a little button there that you can press to open like a live chat or something like that, it's probable that that button has been positioned there with something such as position absolute or maybe even position fixed. you'll see there, that's the interesting thing. When we use position fixed, it's no longer this kind, it doesn't really care about this relative positioning of the container. It's just whatever position on the page itself. So if I bring this to 1 pixel, then it's going to move itself all the way back to the right-hand side. Or what I could do is, if I wanted it to, if I just cared about putting it on the right-hand side, I could do something like that. Oh wait, maybe that's with absolute actually. Oh, do you know what? Never mind. It's not important. Okay, and then one other thing I wanted to just mention as well is something known as the Z-index. So Z-index allows you to layer items on top or underneath each other. If you imagine that the screen, your browser screen, even though it is two-dimensional, you could layer it in a kind of three-dimensional space, hence Z-index. If you think of X coordinates, Y coordinates, and Z coordinates. So to demonstrate this, if we put a background on this of blue, and we'll also put a background on this of RGBA, let's make it red still, but we're going to give it 50% transparency. So we've got these here. Now, typically, if you want to use Z-index, it has to have a position value on it. Okay, so even if it's just relative, you have to put a position index on it. Now, if you imagine that every item on the page has a Z-index of 0 or 1, you can start to manipulate this and change it. So if I wanted this blue block to actually be underneath the red, I could do something such as Z-index 0, and then put Z-index on the actual container of 1. Wait, has that happened? Or can I just not see it? That's strange. Just try this. Okay, that's strange. It doesn't seem to be working. I'm sure there's something that I've not set right on there. Maybe it's the position things. But just know that you can do those things. You can layer items on top of each other if you want a certain effect to exist. Okay, and then finally, we're going to skip the bit on shorthands because we've not, we're kind of low on, well, very short on time. So the final thing I'll just mention is those pseudo classes that we mentioned before. So there are a few different ones available. There's things such as hover. So let's do it on the thing. So we could do something like that. And then as we hover over it, it gives it this color. There's other ones as well, such as active, which is if we actually click on it. So you can see I'm clicking on it there and it does that. There's also other ones like focus or enabled, disabled, things like that, which can be useful when you're doing things like styling a button, for example. So that kind of brings us to the end. Let me just bring the summary bit up. Okay. So, yeah, just to summarize, so CSS is used to style web documents. CSS is made up of selectors, declarations, properties, and property values. Syntax is made up of curly braces, colons, and semicolons. The main selectors are element, ID, class, attribute, and pseudo. Browsers have their own default styles. CSS is mostly based on the box model, but there is also the content model. But most developers opt for the box model. Opt for one or the other when proceeding with CSS, though, because it'll make your life easier. Most elements can have a margin, border, padding, and content. There are many different measurements available to you when handling sizes. Some of the most common ones are em, rem, pix or pixel, percentage, VW, and VH. There are many different measurements available to you when handling colors, and the main ones are color, hex, RGB or RGBA, and HSL or HSLA. There are thousands of available fonts out there. However, give some consideration to your user when picking suitable fonts based on availability and file size. There are a few options available when it comes to styling images. Positioning allows you to take elements out of their normal document flow. The main options available to you are relative, absolute, static, fixed, and sticky. I know we didn't cover sticky, but you can look into it further. And then there's Z-index, which allows you to place elements above and underneath one another. Although the example I gave, it didn't happen, just know that was because of me kind of maybe forgetting something in the moment. Trust me, you can position items above and underneath each other. There's pseudo classes that allow you to add specific styles based on the state of the element. Common states involve hover and active. And finally, it is possible to combine multiple CSS properties into one in some instances, which is something we didn't cover, but I will give you some additional reading regarding that. So that was CSS part 1. Hopefully there were some things that you found useful in there, maybe, and for those of you who maybe don't have so much experience with CSS at the moment, hopefully this gives you a bit more understanding of what is possible and what is capable. There's still plenty more to cover as well, and we'll go into that in week 2, in part 2 of this. Typically, where we'll start to look at things such as how to write kind of scalable CSS. In other words, when you're writing lots and lots of it in one file, how do you make it manageable? We'll also look at some techniques for layouts. So for some of you, you'll probably already be aware of things such as Flex or Flexbox and CSS Grid. So we'll look into that. And we'll also look into media queries, which enables us to be able to make those kind of responsive designs that are important in this day and age. And then we may even have a look at some kind of like new cool things that you can do, like filtering effects and things like making variables in CSS, which is like a super useful thing that you'll appreciate as you go on. So that brings us to the end of the lesson. I'm just going to pause the recording and then we can do a short Q&A session. So let me just stop the recording.